It's the week ending Saturday the 4th of April, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen goats taking over the Welsh town of Llandudno, Public Health England's director announcing plans to ramp up coronavirus testing, and the virus-related death of Fountains of Wayne songwriter Adam Schlesinger, aged 52. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me remotely from the week's digital team, Kari Wilkin and bossman Holden Frith. And from the Week magazine, it's editor Theo Tait. Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Theo, how has it been going trying to produce a print magazine at the moment? I have to ask you.
A little bit challenging in that we're quite an old-fashioned office, and we were, worked in the old-fashioned way, and then suddenly we've had to reconstitute the entire office, virtually, and so everyone is the team is sort of all over England. We've got one in Monmouth, one in Sheffield, Birmingham, Essex, and everyone has to meet up virtually and try to get it all sorted, using the amazing, what does Boris Johnson call it? The wizardry, modern technological wizardry. It seems to be going okay, but it's definitely challenging.
Yeah, I can imagine, because it's quite a tactile thing, a magazine, isn't it? I mean, I know you use a template, obviously. It looks the same every week, but I imagine there's usually a lot of printing out and moving things around on bits of paper.
Absolutely, and there's a lot of usually standing around computers pointing at things, and we can't do that at all now.
Okay, but we can all point at each other in this Zoom conference that we're having, so that's exciting. We can see each other as well as hear. And Holden, you're up first. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Some Singaporeans may be more socially distanced than others.
3 legal challenges against a law that criminalises consensual sex between men have been dismissed by the High Court. Lawyers representing 2 of the 3 plaintiffs indicated their clients will appeal the decision. The court actions were brought by disc jockey Johnson Ong, retired general practitioner Roy Tan, and Brian Chung, a former executive director of an LGBT non-profit organisation. One argument put forward was that Section 377A is unconstitutional, as all gay and bisexual men are obligated to disclose their private sexual acts to the police.
A clip from CNA News there. So, Holden, this is gay rights in Singapore.
Yes, this was the conclusion of a long-running legal attempt to overturn Section 377A of Singapore's Criminal Code. This was the rule which outlawed gay sex and allowed for punishments of up to 2 years in prison. And although prosecutions are rare and lawyers had argued that the law was now obsolete, judges said it was still important in reflecting public sentiment and beliefs, and found that it didn't contravene guarantees of equality and free speech.
Yeah, I mean, just leaving aside our personal feelings here about the law in the first place, what is the coherency of that ruling? Because if it is hardly ever enforced, there are lots of gay people in Singapore, saying non-enforcement of the law against consensual gay sex in private doesn't render it redundant. That's what the court said. Well, doesn't it? I mean, it is redundant. It's not being used.
By all common sense, it seemed to have been redundant. I think the argument that the judges were making was that although it hadn't been used in practice, it had some kind of almost a meaning in spirit, that it was conveying a sense of the conservative mores of Singapore, and that there was sort of broad support for it within the public. But the people who are bringing the case have said that they feel that is it smacks of a fairly arbitrary judicial ruling, and it's not really based in any constitutional sense.
And that broad public support, Kari, is something that I guess goes beyond Singapore, isn't it? In quite a disturbing way to many of us. I know, most of us know that there are plenty of countries where gay sex is still criminalised, places like Iran and Saudi Arabia, but I had no idea it was so many. It's over 70 still.
Yeah, over 70, including many of them former Commonwealth countries. But I think there is a turning tide gradually, and obviously it hasn't worked an attempt to overturn it in Singapore. But there has been success. For example, India repealed similar laws in 2018. Taiwan last year became the first place in Asia to legalise same-sex marriage. So it's gradual.
And there's some good news there, I guess. But also I wonder, Theo, whether the media has some responsibility for possibly not representing those views anymore. I mean, I suspect in our industry, which has, I suspect, a higher than usual proportion of openly gay and bisexual employees, the world is often portrayed as more liberal on these issues than it apparently is.
Yeah, I'm sure that's right. The difference in Taiwan, it was the parliament changed the law, and in this case, maybe there is an argument for saying that it shouldn't be done by a senior court, that it should be done democratically.
Yeah, that certainly makes sense. I think the problem is certainly in the current situation, there seems to be at the moment a slide back towards authoritarianism, perhaps, as a result of many factors, but, because of the current ongoing coronavirus crisis, for example, the lockdown, it's creating all sorts of new measures that mean that are giving governments greater power, but they're not necessarily going to be using it for this sort of, to push this sort of legislation through.
Yeah, and connect the dots on that for us, Holden, with regards to Singapore. This might seem like a left field point to begin with, but Singapore is one of the territories that's being celebrated, isn't it, for having kept the COVID-19 numbers down, partly through use of an app. But that app, of course, involves surveillance, essentially. And I suppose with a ruling like this coming from the court, if you're gay in Singapore, you might be thinking, well, are they going to create some sort of anti-homosexuality app next?
I think one of the arguments that's played out in Singapore for the duration of this court case, which has now been going on for 6 years, is
6 years?
6 years, yes. There was an initial attempt to overturn the law in 2014, which failed, and this is actually the end of that appeals process, although the plaintiffs are likely to appeal again, so we may still not quite be at the conclusion.
That's just the bizarrest detail of this story, actually, for me. I had no idea it had been going on so... I mean, loads of people sitting around in suits debating a law that isn't enacted and whether or not it should be.
Yes, and in fact, the case itself has been criticised by some who feel that they're drawing more attention to this discriminatory law. But I think the recent developments help to show why this could be a problem, because one of the developments that coronavirus has brought about is it has created a very real public need for some sort of social tracking, whether it's self-reported or reported by an app. Singapore, having a relatively authoritarian legal system to start with, has been at the forefront of introducing technological and legal restrictions on what people can do, and also then keeping track of social contacts between individuals. People have been able to go about their business, but you can see why this may raise flags for gay people who worry about the idea of their movements being tracked, their interactions with other people being tracked. And although the Singapore app doesn't create a database of who's been meeting who, all that information is stored locally on individuals' phones, it certainly does raise alarm bells.
It's gay sex in private that is kind of decriminalised but not taken off the statute books, isn't it? Whereas I suppose gay sex in public is something that would still ruffle feathers, and if phones were documenting that, then that could create problems. That
would, but I mean, it could also create a record of who's been seeing who in private. If it got into the wrong hands, or it was being tracked in ways that... I think the other problem with this is that it's very hard for individuals to know what their phones are tracking about them. And so even if the government, which I'm sure it is correct in Singapore in saying that, it is not creating this database, it's very hard for individuals to have faith in that, and or that it may not change in the future. And for gay people, particularly older ones, the idea of a terrifying virus being used to justify repressive laws is not a hypothetical one. Like throughout the 80s, those sorts of that sort of problem was faced with the HIV pandemic, and so I think this raises more specific fears than it might do for the general population.
And this kind of software, it's not foolproof. Actually, it's being reported this week that the UK government is considering, well, it's in fact developing and it's very close to launching a similar tracking app that will basically follow people, see where they're going, and then if they come into contact with someone who subsequently tests positive, then they'll be sent an alert. This sort of use of smartphone location data would be illegal under national and EU privacy laws if it was individual data, but it doesn't violate laws if the data is anonymised. But we've already got people in this country saying, but this software is still vulnerable to hacking, and even though the NHSX, the tech arm of the NHS, which is developing it, even though they've said we're going to set up an ethics board, there are still concerns that it's still open to abuse, both from within the government and potentially from hackers who could use that sort of information to blackmail people, particularly in countries such as Singapore, where at least legally it is, you're not meant to be having gay sex, whether be it in public or in your home.
Okay, I asked you to connect the dots, and you have, but before we go full Black Mirror, I mean, we're supposed to be talking about the direct implications of some of these relatively unreported and niche stories that will happen. This is all very speculative, isn't it? What we know is likely to happen as a result of this is public attitudes about Singapore around the world will be influenced by it. And I wonder, Theo, whether there's a point at which, once we get past the current crisis, and obviously there aren't planes in the sky, tourists, and not just gay tourists either, but tourists of all sexualities, families and everyone else, might start saying increasingly, I don't want to travel on holiday to places that have these kinds of regressive laws against homosexuals.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that would affect, people's attitudes would be affected by these sorts of things. And also multinationals will, have to think about the effects on their employees. If there's a lot of multinationals with a lot of employees in Singapore, they have to think about their own diversity policies and how these things would affect their employees. But I mean, as far as I understand it, there is a gay scene in Singapore, and it's not like many other parts of the world where it genuinely isn't enforced, and there is a sort of a gay scene which is out, and there are pride parades and stuff. So I mean, it's not. It is. There are obviously many countries in the world which would be much more challenging for gay employees of multinational companies, for instance.
Yeah, so Holden, what do you think is actually going to happen next? I mean, are there going to be more protests against this in Singapore? Is this, failed appeal just a step towards a successful one?
I suspect we know the direction this is heading in eventually, and it does feel as if sooner or later there will be an appeal that succeeds. A lot of these laws are in an odd limbo where they were introduced often following the Indian Penal Code of 1861, which itself was based on an English law from 1533, and then they sort of lingered on the various colonial statute books. And by the time the UK got around to repealing them in the late 60s, independence meant that the former colonies kept those on the statute books, and often the newly independent governments evolved an attitude that blamed the UK not for the discriminatory laws, but actually for homosexuality itself. And so there's been a sense almost that the UK was to blame for importing these foreign practices that were not part of indigenous culture, which of course isn't correct. And it's now gradually becoming more acceptable to sort of rediscover a more liberal history within individual independent countries themselves.
There we are. Only took 500 years. I should say, just as a point of clarification before we move on, we've been saying the whole way through this item, homosexuals, homosexuality, gay people, but actually it's gay men specifically, isn't it? If you're a lesbian, it's fine. No rule against you. Yes,
that is correct. And that goes back all the way to that 1533 law and the way that was defined.
Yeah, I can't imagine people in 1533 that were lawmakers who thought that kind of thing was possible. Let's go on. Theo, you're up next after this. Okay, Theo, what do you think this week will be remembered for?
Is the world's coral in hot water?
We've now had 3 major bleaching events on the Great Barrier Reef. In 98, 2002, and again just recently in 2016. We zigzagged along the whole length in a helicopter and fixed-wing plane. We put about 100 people underwater. The extent and severity of this bleaching is off the chart.
A clip from the National Geographic YouTube channel there. Theo, what's the story this week?
The Great Barrier Reef has unheard of by most of us, suffered its third mass coral bleaching episode in 5 years. Basically, coral reefs depend on symbiosis between the little coral polyps that that build up the reefs and microalgae that live inside them. But when the coral gets stressed, particularly when the water gets hot, then they expel these algae, and the algae actually give them their color and all of their nutrients, or nearly all of their nutrients. So when they're expelled, then the coral turns white, and often, but not always, it dies afterwards. So obviously we have had the hottest summer in Australia, second hottest summer on record in Australia, and the latest aerial surveys done by the James Cook University suggest that there is very significant coral bleaching. Reading about this week, I was struck by this quote on Twitter from Professor Terry Hughes, who is the guy doing the survey of the Great Barrier Reef, the aerial survey. He said, "It's been a shitty, exhausting day on the Great Barrier Reef. I feel like an art lover wandering through the Louvre as it burns to the ground."
Okay, so implications obviously for the marine life there, implications for Australia and their tourist industry. What are the implications for me, to be crude about it, if more of the coral reef does get bleached?
Well, obviously the coral reefs are one of the world's great underwater habitats. They are very beautiful and they contribute massively to biodiversity. They will also be, if they are getting wiped out, and a lot of them do seem to, I mean, probably worth saying this is not just we talk about the Great Barrier Reef partly because it is the biggest and the most famous coral habitat, but this is happening all over the world. And there will be a great cascade effect if this is really happening. They think that about 20% of the world's coral reefs are already gone. There will be a massive effect on biodiversity throughout the oceans. And there will also be a big economic effect because about half the fish eaten by humans originate from coral reef habitats.
Well, Kari, Theo brings us on to economics. This is about climate change, really. So what are the economics of continuing the way we're going versus changing things to benefit the coral reef? I mean, there is now global recognition that climate change needs to be fought, that greenhouse gases need to be reduced. There's the Paris Agreement for everyone apart from the States. But to accelerate funding to deal with this kind of thing, which would be the implication of this thought process, when the world is going to be recovering from, in likelihood, a post-COVID depression, that seems a far hope, doesn't it?
It does, but then on the other hand, you could say that this pause in manufacturing, where we're seeing air pollution dropping in cities all around the world as a result, just within weeks of lockdowns being introduced, you could say this offers a real life experiment, and it gives us the chance to reevaluate and rewire, if you like, look at how we're treating the world and the effects. I mean, and you're talking about the economic costs. I mean, just going back to reefs alone, the WWF says that coral reefs provide close to $30 billion each year in goods and services. So even if this isn't about saving the environment for the sake of, the animals, we've all got a huge amount to lose. And as you say, particularly after the effects of the coronavirus, when they're devastating economies worldwide, again, just to go back to the reef, the good news of this latest mass bleaching, if there is any, is that tourist areas in the northern and central parts, such as near Cairns and Port Douglas, have experienced only moderate bleaching. So hopefully the corals there can recover and tourism can get back on its feet. But you can look on this as a warning call. If tourism is going to continue in these places and all the other industries that are linked to these ecosystems, this is the perfect time to come out of it, to after this, maybe for future economic stimulus packages to include measures to cut greenhouse gas emissions.
But I'm reminded, Holden, of Felicity on last week's show with her rhino conservation story, which was actually a good news story. But the arguments are the same, aren't they? You understand why it's very important to shine a light on environmental stories, particularly now whilst attentions are elsewhere, but you understand why attentions are. Is it unrealistic that they won't be?
I think it is, but it's also worth keeping an eye on the horizon and trying to imagine a world in which coronavirus isn't dominating the headlines, because we will get there one day.
It's and actually only been like 3 weeks to 3 months, depending on what you measure as the crux. Yeah. And
it's hard to believe, but I think if we can try and salvage some kind of positive from it, it is the case. The world has mobilised itself in really an unprecedented way to attempt fairly extreme solutions to an imminent problem. We have a much longer term problem on our hands, which is climate change, and it's harder to get that same level of motivation because it is in the what feels still like the far future, even though it may not be as far away as some people imagine. But it took and is still taking the point of large numbers of deaths being 2 to 3 weeks away for us to take this kind of action around coronavirus. And there are countries where they're still not taking what feels like the common sense precautions because they haven't yet seen the sort of surge that we're seeing here. We've now got to try and kind of harness those sorts of energies towards something which may not manifest itself for another decade or two. And I don't mean that we have to entirely abandon air transport or the industrial economy. I just mean that we will have to factor in a different way of life.
Yeah, and if we can learn the lesson from that, one thing, as Holden was saying, is this coronavirus response has taught us is that cross-border threats do require global systematic responses as well as individual behaviour changes. And as Holden says, this has proved that we can do that. We can share data and work together. So at least you could say this has been an experiment proving that it can be done. Whether it will be done remains to be seen.
Theo, you said in your introduction to the topic that the world's reefs are being exposed to this. Are they? Which ones? Where else might this happen?
Well, I think it's tropical reefs primarily that are under risk, but particularly from the temperature thing. But the IPCC thinks that a majority of tropical reefs will disappear even if global warming is limited to 1.5 centigrade, which is, an extremely optimistic outlook. So, I have to say, though, I'd like to think we could do something about it. I think it does look very bleak, the situation. And part of the problem is that it does seem that these are becoming more like an annual event on the Great Barrier Reef, because usually they usually only happen when it's an El Nino year, and it isn't an El Nino year this year. So the concern is that this will become an annual thing, and that the more they bleach, the harder it is for them to recover, and the more likely they are to die altogether.
Yeah, Australia downgraded its 5-year reef outlook from poor to very poor recently.
There's a few signs of hope in a very bleak picture. As Theo was saying, the Great Barrier Reef is actually not even the most seriously affected. Caribbean reefs have lost about 80% of their coral since the 1970s. And the issue with global warming is that it makes these events more frequent, more extreme, and much harder to recover from. So the sort of what was previously a fairly natural cycle where there would be some damage and then reefs would have several years to recover is now coming at such a pace that it's the only way they're going to be able to survive is if they can adapt to a warmer temperature. And there are a few signs in reefs around the Andaman Sea, in the area sort of Thailand, Indonesia and Malaysia, that some adaptation may be taking place. So corals that have ejected their usual species of algae are actually being colonized by different species of algae which can achieve the same sort of symbiotic relationship at a higher temperature. And so they're able to survive in waters at a temperature that was previously not thought possible. And so there has been the suggestion that those sorts of algae could be artificially introduced to other reefs in an attempt to try and extend that sort of natural adaptation process and keep those reefs alive.
I don't suppose in the tradition of fun facts on this podcast that you have the name of one of these hero algae to hand, do you?
Since we are recording remotely, I do have access to Wikipedia.
A glimpse under the magician's cloth.
I think it's Zooxanthinae.
Good enough for me. I mean, I feel as host I should be awarding points. But, if anyone remembers that in a conversation, I'll be very impressed. Okay, Kari, you're up next after this. Okay, Kari, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
If you're not happy and you know it, raise your hand.
I'm Professor Laurie Santos, a professor in psychology and cognitive science, and I'm excited that you're going to join me on this journey to learn a little bit about the science and also the practice of well-being. I started these lectures here in Silliman College, right here in my home, to introduce a small set of students to the science of psychology. And we thought that it might be so beneficial to Yale students, we wanted to bring it to a bigger group. And that's where you come in.
Professor Laurie Santos describing her Science of Wellbeing course from the Yale Courses YouTube. Kari, it all sounds very nice, but what is the significance of this story?
There's been a huge push in recent years towards courses and using science to try to teach us happiness. But, for obvious reasons in recent weeks, this online Yale course has seen 1.7 million people worldwide enrolling. This course was actually set up in 2018 in response to high levels of student depression and stress, and it's actually become the largest class in Yale's 300-year history, with nearly a quarter of the entire student body taking it. Particularly at the moment, but generally, we are all seeking ways to be happier, to have a greater sense of well-being in our life. Incidentally, Friday the 20th of March was International Day of Happiness. I think probably that bypassed most people this year. But I do think it raises questions about how, can science teach us to be happy? Is it something that can be learned, or is it just innate and you're stuck with whatever you're born with?
So is this course literally teaching people, why and how well-being techniques work to make you feel better? Or is it just teaching you the techniques?
I think that's what's interesting, that you do have these prestigious establishments like Yale now doing this. This isn't, your local sort of guru. And Santos, the woman who runs the course, says it's a way of taking agency over your mental health and doing so in an evidence-based way. And essentially, students are offered insights from psychology and neuroscience about what drives happiness, and then given daily behavioral change exercises to help rewire the brain. And again, I think it's that expression, rewiring the brain. That's not just jargon. Developments in technologies such as MRI scans has given us a far greater insight in recent years into how changing our behaviors and doing things that make us happy can actually rewire our brain, change our brain permanently to make us happier. As a very gross simplification, MRI scans have found that the left side of the frontal lobe of the brain, known as the left prefrontal cortex, is more active when people feel happy. And conversely, the right side's more active when we feel sad.
I wonder, Holden, whether the very act of subscribing to these kinds of courses in the first place is in itself something that benefits people's happiness. The sense that you're taking positive action about your well-being is in itself something that makes you feel better.
I think that might be a big part of it. I think being more aware of what it is that's making you unhappy, if you are unhappy. Is it spending too much time scrolling through Twitter and getting more and more irritated or upset by what you're seeing? And if you can sort of take the step of understanding that that's something you want to take action on, that's really the first step towards setting that aside and putting something else in its place.
And I do wonder as well whether the clear demand for this kind of course, partly because people are obviously sort of trapped at home and trying to remote access stuff like this at the moment, and they're depressed, obviously that kind of plays into it. But the demand that there is for this, millions of adults wanting to learn how to be happy, if that really is a demand in grown-ups, is this something that should actually be on the school curriculum when we're kids?
Well, they have found that certainly children we know have much more elastic brains. So perhaps doing these practices such as CBT, I know my kids do yoga at school, so you could argue that they are doing that they're teaching kids to do these things that will strengthen this left side of their brains to make that more dominant. A 2-month course called Exploring What Matters, which is run by volunteers, not professionals, for a charity called Action for Happiness, found that doing this course was more effective at boosting life satisfaction than finding a partner or landing a job. And participants rated their satisfaction levels as increasing from an average of 6.4 out of 10 to 7.4 after doing this course, whereas they rated, for example, finding a partner as increasing their satisfaction level by just about 0.5%, at half a point.
Clearly, people experience a benefit to doing these sorts of courses, but I think the fact that they are self-reported does make it harder to draw distinct conclusions about them. And some of the statistics that have been published recently have also come from analysis of images posted on social media, on Flickr, on Instagram, and trying to tie in particular activities people have been doing when they've reported more happiness, more joy. And I think the problem there is that often the happiness can have a sort of element of performance to it, particularly on social media, where people are they're not giving necessarily an entirely honest view of their mood in any given post.
Because there's a pressure to be happy now as well, isn't there? The wellness industry is huge. Podcasts and apps about wellness and well-being are massive. And so I wonder whether when we all place more importance on being happy, as we've talked about on the show over the last few years, is a kind of growing trend, people are aware that they feel unhappy and depressed counterintuitively.
Yeah, I think there's also a risk of implying that to be unhappy is a disorder, perhaps, and that there's something wrong with that. Where if bad things happen to people, then feeling unhappy is a natural and maybe an essential part of coming to terms with that and processing it. The risk, I suppose, is if that becomes a habit in itself, and there's no way to sort of move beyond that and to experience the other parts of life.
How are you all keeping happy during the lockdown? I might finish by asking you, Theo, what is actually making you happy at the moment?
I've confined myself to my room for the last week, and it's been great. It's my meals are passed through the outside window into a tiny box room where I'm living. The children refer to me as the prisoner, and I've been working a lot. That's about it, really.
Holden?
I've been doing a lot more cooking than usual, using the time that I'm not spending commuting and going to the gym and socialising and all of those other things that used to be part of my life. But
set up a delivery service. It sounds like Theo's kids could use it.
Yeah, I'll send them over. But no, I think people talk about cooking and gardening and DIY and those sorts of things as activities which give them pleasure, because it's creative in a fairly low key way. You're concentrating a little bit, but not too much. Your hands have something to do, and you're usually creating something that you can either enjoy yourself or enjoy with other people. And
Kari, you brought this subject to our attention. Are you happy?
Yeah, ish. Homeschooling's making me very unhappy, but otherwise, decorating, but I've run out of walls now, and running once a day and wine, but not together.
Well, I am happy enough with that, so that is it for another edition of The Week Unwrapped. Thank you very much to Kari Wilkin, Holden, Frith and Theo Tait. Remember, you can listen to The Week Unwrapped's entire back catalogue right now. Just search for, guess what, The Week Unwrapped, using your podcast app of choice. We have a large back catalogue now, most of which will put a smile on your face. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sarah Miles at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.